Hey everybody, Philosophy Society Achilles Justice. So it's July 19th, 2023. I'm here with my friends, and we are talking about just, you could say, personal stuff. And part of the social context of the Philosophy Society is to not have a hierarchical formation in the sense where there's an appeal to authority issue. And we see this in educational institutions, political institutions, and religious institutions, where there's someone who's at the top of the hierarchy, and just them saying something can induce conformity within the group, and they will believe whatever that person says, independent of whether it's true or false, right? And so one way that I circumvent this bias is to just be open and transparent about stuff. Now, I skipped the recording of personal stuff. Part of the reason is because I don't want to say things about other people and then post this online. It's disrespectful to their privacy. But I can, now that I've kind of communicated it to the people in the room, that's one of the benefits of being in the room, is that you get to hear the nitty gritty shit that Achilles is dealing with in his personal life. Yeah, and I think it's important for me to be vulnerable and transparent. So one of the initial chapters in my book of practical philosophy is about intimacy. And intimacy is 4 properties: vulnerability, which is to show your weakness to others; transparency, which is an accurate representation of whatever is going on with you; reciprocation, which is kind of like a tit for tat, fair distribution of either effort or taking turns; and then dialogue, that there's some communication that has a feedback within it, that you're not talking past each other, but you're talking about content and it makes sense, and then you're communicating. And so when we look at like other social organizations, like I said, religion, politics, and the educational institution, there is this position of authority, and the workplace, position of authority context, where, especially in a therapeutic situation, you know, like in my counseling practice, I do talk about my personal life as an example to create trust and a bond with whoever is I'm communicating with. And I feel it's important because it makes me more human, instead of just this impartial, almost robotic observer of the other person's life. And it takes away from that hierarchy, you know? And I think it's important to keep that in mind all the time, because these social biases affect our abilities to think critically, to be reasonable. It engages in system 1 like thinking, which is our old evolutionary apparatus. And sometimes that might be right. You know, sometimes listening to your feelings is the right thing to do. It is important, because your instincts can guide you in a way that your prefrontal cortex, your linguistic analytic brain, it's just beyond that, you know? And so we could say that wisdom, and this also can be reminiscent of the Serenity Prayer, wisdom is the ability to discriminate between, do I think about this thing, or do I go by how I feel, you know? And Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, kind of goes into that. And sometimes for myself, what I'll do is I will, like in certain situations, there may be an immediate response necessary, you know? Like I talked in the past about, like, that guy was trying to fight me at that dance place. Like in the moment, it's like, this is a fight or flight situation. Like, this guy is actually assaulting you right now. You know what I mean? And so it's important to respond immediately. And that individual lacks the capacity for reason, you know? And then some situations, you know, like financing a vehicle, for example, you know, like that is important to think about and to plan it out and to make a rational, logical, informed decision, especially when your credit's on the line and these kinds of things, right? So I think it's important to take away from me being vulnerable in these meetings, and if I disclose information, I also try to show that it's a safe place. That if I want to lead by example. That if I can show this is what's going on in my life, then it's also open for everybody else to communicate what's going on in their lives, if there is something going on. And I don't think it's appropriate to like come from a position where I have this wall up and I expect other people to divulge personal information, but I never divulge it myself. You know, like part of the practice of being mentally healthy is like looking at the personality disorders and identifying the symptoms, right? And I always, narcissism is like my punching bag. Like if we had, I almost got to draw it, you know, let's just have fun here for a second. Like if I had a punching bag and it's like chained up, narcissism. And we're hitting it, you know? I don't know why. I do. They're like, let me talk about why. But it's, you know, I think it's, I guess just because like when people are narcissistic and I'm trying to be constructive and I'm trying to be pro-social, and then they manipulate, like they use deception or they reframe the dialogue to suit their self-esteem, and it takes away from the truth, it irritates me. It's like you're not, like I'm making progress here and then you're taking us 3 steps back, you know, like if you could just accept responsibility, for example, or not make shit up, like we would get some progress here and we could go do other stuff. You know, we don't have to waste our time. And it's not like you could just, is it a waste of time? I don't know. But see, it feels like a waste of time when someone just can't be like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say or do that. Like, how can we make it better? Whereas if you exclude yourself from social context, you'll never have the environmental or social pressure to learn and respond to things. And so you could say, well, that was stupid of you. Why did you go in there and do that? And the wisdom may be in the understanding that I know I'm going to make a mistake here, but the lesson I learn from whatever this mistake is the valuable, reason why I'm doing it. And so, yeah. And so I want people to feel comfortable expressing themselves and being able to open themselves up about whatever's going on with them, such that this is not just like a lecture-based group. And then you could say like kind of delves into a bit more of a group therapy thing. Legally not allowed to give therapy, and I understand that. But the function socially and is there, is that we're being supportive for each other. And just that in itself, evidence shows that that's almost enough to help people out with most problems that they have. So me being vulnerable and talking about my own personal life is to say that, you know, I think it gives even more credit to you guys that are here, because if I'm sharing information with you, that shows I trust your judgment. And I'm saying, hey, what do you guys think? You know, like, can you use the information we put on the table and apply it to me, right? In a way that shows that I'm not immune or perfect. And Nalia's like, perfect. I'm going to bite you right now. And I think that as a context, the way that we're relating to each other is super important. So yeah, hello, thank you for joining. Oh wait, maybe she can join the meeting now. All right, she has to enter still. When I admit, there's like that's step 1, and then they have to accept. So this is one of those editing moments.
I'm gonna be getting 3 more people. I totally forgot to send them the link to it.
Can they not add in the WhatsApp chat?
One of them doesn't have a phone yet. And I will add the other 2. I don't have administration for.
Can't you just copy and paste the thing? Okay, I can give it to you, but it's
no,
a
big. I have it. Like I copied it.
Okay.
But I can't add people to the group.
No, you can't. No admin. Only him.
Unless it become like.
I can give you guys admin status. We will have to have a meeting about that, but I can do it.
Let's do it.
Okay. So this is all stuff that I would edit out of just that right there. So that's like editing stuff. Dennis is living with me, by the way. Dennis, you can edit this out. He's the video guy.
Is he? Oh, really?
Is he attending too?
Is he there?
No, but he will watch this at some point in the next few weeks. He edited the one where Safiso was there. That's his name? I think so. Remember the guy who were in that room? Just the 3 of us? He just did that one and uploaded it. I have to add the name to it. So anyways, this is all this stuff. Okay, so we can figure out other administrative duties and tasks to help the group grow. And yes, like for example, if you wanted to help out with Dennis, we can talk about that. But you are leaving soon, so whatever.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So yeah, so what we want to see is like there are social contexts like this. This is my narcissism punching bag. I give narcissism a shot, you know? And
How do you do that?
like this. That's not how you punch it.
Metaphysically, how do you do that?
Well, whenever I have an example of something, I always refer to narcissism. And the reason is because the disorder in itself, those people are resistant towards feedback and criticism, which just completely trumps cognitive behavioral therapy. Like they will not perceive themselves, that's the problem they have, like one of the problems they have, as having any issues whatsoever. And what they'll do is they'll lie, they'll reframe things, you know, to make it seem like you're the issue. They'll identify that like you're gaslighting them, when really it's like, can we just not just like talk about this? Because there's other things to do in life. Then, you know, it's like if you're, what they'll do is if you say, hey, this is happening, they'll move over here out of the way, right? And then you're like, oh, okay, well, hey, this is happening, they'll move again. And so like what you really will do, if they keep on moving, there's only so many moves they can make, right? If you're in like, I have a lot of practice with this in my housing program, people that live with me. And for example, I'm like, you didn't do the dishes. Super basic. Like it's super basic. Like it's like you can't, or you didn't flush the toilet. Like it's some of the most basic stuff that you could ever criticize a person on, right? And sometimes you may be incorrect. It wasn't them, right? And so you're at fault. The giver of feedback was false. The feedback was false, right? And that happens sometimes. Okay, sure. However, if we have like, so like, let's say it's like dishes, right? And so we have a graph. And so trial one is like, did you do the dishes? And they're like, no. I'm like, okay. And then tomorrow, oh, I see the dishes again. And then say, hey, did you do the dishes? And they're like, no. And so what'll happen is even though the first instance, they may say it wasn't them, you just say, okay, because what happens is you can get frustrated. Like, I know it was you, right? And then you kind of become a little arrogant and you're not open to feedback. So what we need to do is we need to have a way that's universalizable, like using a Kantian ethical paradigm. So some kind of a maxim that applies to everybody. It applies to the person giving feedback and the person receiving feedback, right? And so you say, that's okay. Maybe I am wrong. Maybe it wasn't you. But what will happen is over time, after many, many instances, you're going to see a pattern. So don't worry about one instance. Let that slide. That's okay. That's okay. If it wasn't you this time, it's okay. Because I have a big net, right? And there's going to be some fish in there. I'm going to get you, right? Because it's not that it's not real, right? Like I could say, there's a fire in the building and go, and freak out. And you're all like, what the fuck are you talking about, bro? There's no fire in the building. Like there is something going on with you, right? Like this is like, now we have psychosis at the thing. And that's a different thing, right? In this context, just to like live with people, and living with people is almost like the basic, the most fundamental, like for functionality. It's like we can't really go lower than that. Like when you go lower than that, that's being institutionalized / being homeless. But you're still in society, so you don't want to go down there, right? At the very least, you want to be able to cooperate with some people in a group in some kind of a housing setting. Yeah.
What if you're like extremely depressed, like on a really high scales of the Burns scale? When should be below the living means? Because a lot of times when you're depressed, you don't shower, you don't eat, you don't brush your teeth. You don't really meet the standard of the basis of living. Right?
So there's your own personal needs, right? And there's how you're meeting those needs, like basic need stuff. When I say living, I mean like living like with others.
Like a tribe type of thing.
So even the depressed person, right? So this is like problem, depressed. And we would just apply the social context to the depressed person, and then they would get better. So the function would be the distortion stuff, and then like the reality checking. For example, like the pleasure predicting principle, the pleasure predicting sheet. So I don't want to eat. I don't want to get out of bed. Well, what degree of not wanting to get out of bed do you feel? I feel like it would be 70% suffering if I actually got out of bed. Okay. And then you write that down and then you test it. And you're like, it actually wasn't even that bad at all. I feel really good that I got out of bed. Right? That's the reality testing thing that we learned in the Burns stuff. So, but the problem with the narcissism thing is if you say you did something, they will reframe and keep on moving. And the thing is there's only so many moves they can make. So what you do is you just write down the move, or you log the response. So you say, okay, so you had response 1, which was reframing. So reframing is when the frame is the context of dialogue, right? So if I say, reframing also kind of goes into the gaslighting thing a little bit. If I say, hey, you left the door open. And they say, you're just on a power trip and you're trying to use your authority, right? You're not responding to the content of what my communication is. You're reframing it to attack my character in my efforts to communicate some issue with behavior, right? It may be the case that I have an authority problem. So what you can do, so let's say, so it's like person 1, they say the door was left open. Or let's even make more specific. You left the door open. And then person 2, you're on a power trip. Okay, so there's a fallacy here, right? The person 2 is not responding to the content of what person 1 is saying. What person 1 is saying, so person 1, this can be true or false. That's the first thing you want to figure out. Is their criticism even real? Right? The second thing is person 2's content. So if you're person 1, what you want to do is you want to go to the content itself, right? So there's like a meta-analysis here. So it's like move 1 is criticism of behavior. And then move 2 would be observation of, it's like, why are you criticizing? So it's not whether the criticism is true or false, but it's just that criticism exists. So you shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't be questioning, for example, my authority, right? Or you shouldn't be, anything that makes me uncomfortable is always wrong. Doesn't matter what it is. I always need to feel good. So the evaluation of feedback is not based in truth. It's based in emotional reasoning, right? And so what you can do is, so the problem here is it's not Socratic. But it can be the case that, and it's a meta-analysis of behavior, which is fine. That may be the case. For example, if I say you left the door open and then you yell and get angry and you're almost violent, say, fuck you, you piece of shit, I'm gonna fucking kill you, right? That exchange, we need to actually step away from the content, and we do need to focus on the person's behavior here, right? And in like bullying or in other social situations, this move to look at like the meta-analysis of behavior is actually important. So what you would want to do is you would want to have like one tier is content and the other tier is behavior. And you can do both. And the behavior needs to be good. So the person, so for example, in that personal example, I won't go into specific details, but I'll just like make it general. The individual I was communicating with, their behavior was over the top. Their behavior was very disrespectful. It was it put both our lives in danger because I was driving at night on the highway. And so one response, like when I reflect back, one response was as I was driving back into Toronto, like let's say this is like the trip to Toronto right here. Like this is when they started getting upset. And they kind of went down a bit, and then they actually got upset again. You know? Right here, I could have just turned around and brought them home. Right? I could have stopped the car, because over here I did that. But this is my mistake I made. In my mind, I was like, I have an objective. I need to meet that objective no matter what. But having boundaries is saying, if you breach this threshold of emotional stability, then the objective is forsaken. Right? So like, let's say I go out bowling and I come home and my partner gets super pissed off at me because I was out bowling. Right? They're like, you went out bowling. You know, you're cheating on me or something like that. I make the round like a cat being like sassy. And they can communicate that they're uncomfortable. They can say, hey, I don't feel comfortable with this, blah, 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 whatever it might be. Or they can be super emotionally loaded and not be in control of their emotions, right? And so what you can do is you can have a timeout. That's like a response. And there's two things. You can send them to their room, or you can remove yourself from the environment. So you can say, I'm uncomfortable with the way you're speaking to me right now. It's inappropriate. I'm going to go for a walk. When I get back, if I feel comfortable, we can continue talking because I care about how you feel, but not to the point where it makes me feel not good, right? And you can do that like 10 times. Be like, well, you know what? It's the 10th time I've had to leave the house. I'm going to go stay in a hotel tonight. And tomorrow, and now we have to spend money. Tomorrow, we can talk about this. But I want to feel safe and comfortable while we're having this discussion. If I don't, maybe I'll stay out again.
Not happening in real life.
It can though. It can. I'm saying you don't have to tolerate abuse. There's always a way for you, because me driving on the highway while this person was enraged was super unsafe, right? And when we look at a behavioral response approach towards other people and how they treat us, this meta-analysis of behavior, I can remove myself from the environment as a form of negative reinforcement. I'm taking something away, right? And I'm not enabling their abusive behavior. That's important. So, okay, time out. So that's my reflection. I could have left and went back, right? And so part of the reason, going back to the initial thing I was talking about, part of the reason that I am divulging my own personal stuff is to show that I use this information, this content, and this is how I apply it. And the reason I express it to others is to have them also give me feedback to make sure that I am, like, I don't believe that I'm always correct. Yeah.
Are they getting a feedback showing that care that's going up? Are they getting a feedback at some point from you that it's reaching that threshold for you?
Okay, this example?
Yeah.
The person became triggered and they were not reasonable at all. And they kept, like, there's like a snowball effect with anger. If people haven't learned to deal with their anger, they will keep on making themselves more angry. And they will bring things to mind to fuel that anger, right? That's not good. I used to do that when I was in my 20s. I just didn't understand how to take myself out of it and approach it from a different perspective, right? So, okay, so what's your question exactly? I don't know if I understand.
So as they're going up that curve, are they receiving feedback from you that they're reaching your threshold?
Yeah, so this is the feedback part, right? So this is like behavior, you're giving feedback. And then here you're responding to like what they say. Like you're having dialogue, right? I was in dialogue mode mostly. I did a little bit of feedback, but it didn't matter. They were not of sound mind in that moment, right? So that's where you can just, you can, it's in a lot of, I think it's better. Like when I look back at that context, it would have been better for me to just do this instead. because it would have taught them that that's not appropriate to act that way.
So would you mind not at the details of what the feedback was in general, like in this sort of situation when someone is reaching your threshold, how would the shape of feedback be general?
Like how would I draw it on here? Well, you would say, so like if we have, like if this is an intensity, so this is like, you know, like let's say if someone assaults you, that's like 10, right? And then there's like degrees from 0 to 10 in the anger thing, right? And so part of it is like, I think if they get to like a 3, like if it goes up and they can't come back down, then, you know, if it just keeps on going up, that's where you can kind of draw the line and say, this is, maybe it's better if we just do this another day, right? And if the person's receptive to feedback and they're like, I do need a timeout, give me a moment. Like if they're receptive, then that might be okay. Then maybe you can work with them. But part of the problem is that people just get, they have the capacity to get enraged and it can just go out of control, right? And so, yeah, you have to determine this on your own. You have to figure this out. This is something that you have to have a sense for, like the practical wisdom within the moment to know how to deal with stuff. I'm just saying this is an option. This was an alternative way for me to deal with that situation. So the reframing thing, right? So when we say, hey, you did this thing, and the person says, oh no, why are you even criticizing me? Are you having a bad day? You're having a bad day today, aren't you? Right? And in some ways, the narcissist is gaslighting you. They're saying there's something wrong with your state of mind that's leading you to criticize me. They're not responding to the content. So the only time that the behavioral feedback is appropriate is when you're like not of sound mind, or when the content is blatantly just false, or if it's like malicious. If me, see, that's the thing, is that the narcissist context is any feedback can be perceived as malicious, and that's just not true, right? That's not realistic. Like if your shoelace is untied, and I'm like, hey, your shoelace is untied, and then you get upset with me for saying that. Well, how does it affect me? You know, it's you that's going to fall. Or if there's like food on your face or something like that, or, you know, you have a booger hanging out of your nose, right? And I say it, and I don't say it in front of everyone to embarrass you. I'm like, hey, by the way, blah, blah, blah. You know, clean yourself or something, whatever the hell it is. The point is just the response to it. And so the narcissism punching bag, the reason I say that is because this way of dealing with feedback and criticism, of avoiding it and pretending it doesn't exist, and all the techniques that can be used from an emotional standpoint to do that, that's a problem. From the living with others baseline, it creates a whole bunch of issues, right? And so, and I'm not even really going into like lying about stuff. Like people can be like strictly deceptive, you know, like there's like in some movies, there's like the patient and the psychiatrist, and the patient is like outthinking the psychiatrist or the therapist, and they're like lying, they're like explicitly deceiving them to the point where the therapist can't even tell, you know? And so, yeah. Yeah, and so in the hierarchy, so this is like social, right? There's like the person with authority at the top, and then there's, you know, like degrees of authority, you could say. And so the problem with this structure is like there's issues of conformity, right? That just being someone just saying something from up here, people that are lower on the totem of the hierarchical situation here, they will just agree, independent of whether it's true or false. And Ash's experiment with the lines, right? And we say, well, which line? What's the relationship of these lines? Are they equal? Are they unequal? And if 4 of 5 people in the room all lie and they say all the lines are equal, one person, more than 50% of their responses will agree with other people, especially when they're in the room with them. Yeah.
I believe that these dynamics also exist within a toxic family system, where there is one revered person at the very top of the pyramid, and in spite of facts and feedback from other members of the family, if it doesn't correspond with what the person at the very top says, it seems like, it's just basically whatever that person at the very top says, whether it be a patriarchal figure, the rest of the family seem to kind of protect that and agree with it in spite of the truth that's in front of them. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so what we're looking for here, so like being philosophical, like in the standard like context, is really only looking at the dialogue content and taking reason and applying it to that and saying, is what you're saying reasonable, right? But if we don't include people's behavior or their intentions or their state, right, then it's kind of naive. Like, and then you could just like, if you just say like, I'm only going to associate with people that are reasonable. It's like, what portion of the population are you excluding now? And how do you define being reasonable, right? Because sometimes I'm not reasonable. Sometimes I'm fucking do stupid shit, you know? And part of my maturity and self-awareness is to be like, that's the case for everybody, you know? And us having a social group as like a barometer, we can like help ourselves float, you know, and not just sink or be like a rocket and go all the way up like right into the sun. You know, that's not good for you, right? You need to be at a balanced level. And so how do we do that? Well, that's why we need to have like the social context, right? There's all these, let me draw this. I'll just draw it with I like to use circles. So if we have a bunch of people, the way we relate to each other, that in itself can be, the way we relate to each other as a social group, these connections, that's what I'm looking at. I'm saying that's important. That is a property. Or there is something going on there. Like part of the philosophical thing I'm doing here is how do I use words to describe this phenomena? We know that there are individuals and there's some means of relation between them. This move one, move two, like criticism of behavior, and then the meta-analysis of the fact of criticizing, that is a move, right? And so say as, when I did that presentation before, did you watch that one? I think you did.
Say as.
It was the mental health, overcoming mental health link I put on YouTube. You would like this, good. So he says that it's the rules that people play in a social context. If you see each other as like pieces on like a chessboard, for example, or some other kind of game, the way that we play the game is what will give you a mentally healthy life, right? So there's moves you can make independently. You can be like a single individual who's doing stuff. Like there's stuff you're doing on the outside and stuff you're doing on the inside. And then there's like stuff between people, right? And then there's the group, the whole thing like that. And so the first thing is, what is our relationship with ourselves, right? And so one factor is like, so we go over here, this is like the self. One is like emotion or how I feel. Okay. And we had all these properties last time: attention, nonverbal behavior, verbal behavior, semantics, or like the verbal content of my thoughts and stuff, what I say. And then we have like also our actions and behavior. I think a very useful way or a pragmatic way to understand action and behavior is decisions and actions are intentional. I'm deciding to do them. I'm acting, right? Whereas behavior and habit is automatic. It's something I may have not intended. So as I'm speaking right now, I have mannerisms, right? I'm not thinking about them. I'm doing them as a flow.
Your action became a behavior.
Yes.
Because initially you were never like that. You had to teach your brain to fire in that pattern.
Yeah.
And then it became behavior.
Yeah. Sometimes I might like think and I'm like trying to describe something. So it's not like the whole of them was all just behavioral, but like right there, like me, I felt itchiness in my eye. That was just like a reaction to some physiological sensation I had, you know? So there's certain things. So I think that's a good distinction to make here, because one of them is intentional, the other one's not. Because that way, if someone does something, like that person that was enraged, that's like just basically behavior. And what we want to do is we want to like intersect action in there. I want to say, do you have self-control? Can you stop being so pissed off right now? Like, what can we do? What are our options here? One of the options was the timeout. We're going to take a little break. A little break for a minute. Okay. The other one is like, I'm going to have a bath. We'll talk about this later. I don't have baths like ever. The other one would be, you know, there's different things we could do. You know, one is breathing. You know, you could listen to something. You could call somebody that knows you really well and can help calm you down because they know you really well. So, okay. So yeah. So there's things that you do with yourself, right? And then in relation to the other. So this is something like Sartre talks about this a lot. So there's the self and then the other. And then this is like a huge like other to the nth degree. Could be like many others. Like you could be standing in an auditorium of like 1,000 people, right? And so having this context where the other is perceiving me, it changes the way I'm behaving and the way I'm acting. Independent if I was just like on my own. So I did like a study with these kids on Halloween, and they had one instance where there was a big bowl of candy and it said, take as much as you want. And the kids would just be like, take it all, right? It's all mine. And then another one where they put a mirror with where the kids were taking the candy. And or the kid, maybe it was like, take what is fair, or take one. There's different ways you could do it. And when the kids were aware of themselves, when they could see themselves, they were more fair. They would only take the one candy, right? So just and there was actually no physical person monitoring them, right? So this is important. Just one other is a thing. And then you can get like a situation where there's like 2 other people perceiving you, and then they're a group, right? That's always like a good thing or a bad thing when you start to increase the number of people, right? Because you can be outvoted. Yeah.
I see for actions, if the action is like an addiction, let's say smoking cigarettes or drinking coffee, isn't it both like an action and behavior because it's like embedded into you? It's like a habit, but you still consciously still want to smoke a cigarette, for example.
Yeah. So that's the thing. Is like,
How you
so the action stuff, that whole chunk, you can decide to not decide to do shit. I'm not going to choose to be an asshole. I'm not going to fucking be an asshole today. Oh, I'm going to do it. You know,
some people do.
Some people do, and that's like maybe an unwise decision, right? I in advance can say I'm always going to approach situations from a loving context. I want to lead with love. It's like a motto I made for people I care about. And then we could have a retroactive response to when we do poor behavior. Like, okay, that wasn't, and then I'm going to visualize an alternative way to train myself to not behave that way in the future. Because sometimes it's automatic, right? Like, and so this individual that got upset, the next day, like we put like day 2 down here or something like that, early on in the day, they were like, I realized that everything I did there was a problem. And so that's a big deal. I said, okay, there we go. Right? Whereas some people, like, and then on day 3 and 4, there was more of this. And, you know, so whatever that. But at least the acknowledgement and the awareness that there's something going on here, we can work with that. If they truly just keep on avoiding it, that's where we get into the issue of like, you know, this is very delusional at this point because it's just, you know, and almost psychotic. You know, it's like a little bit of psychosis going on because you can't even see yourself. You are part of reality too, right? The belief that your perspective is the only perspective, that very like solipsistic Like there's no other people. You're all just like figments of my imagination or in my mind. That's like, I don't know about that, you know? So yeah, so there's our relation to ourselves, then there's the relation to the other, and then there's the group dynamic. Yeah, I understand that. So this is part of what we're doing. And so at a very beginning level, we have our philosophical application of reason, super useful, and we can go through that for a long time. You know, there's people doing PhDs, people that have PhDs that are just in the sea of doing this. However, this interaction between self, other, and within the group, this is something that I think is super important. And this will facilitate our capacity to be reasonable within content. Why? Because of the social biases that exist in every one of these categories, social and psychological biases. So my view is that if we don't have a social context that accounts for these problems, you will always have a limitation on how reasonable you're being with content. It'll just be the case. You'll do a whole dissertation and it'll be false from the beginning, but you'll spend 4 years doing all the research to prove what you think is true, when really the initial impetus to even start that was based in unsound reasoning. And because you spent, I don't know, 5-6 years in university, you have the ability to defend more than anyone can criticize you, but your trajectory was just wrong from the beginning. And so for me, that's a waste of life. And we would want less people to make those decisions. It's better for more philosophers to be on the right path from the beginning, right? Than just, you know, in 200 years, nobody remembers them. It was just a waste. Like maybe they felt good, but wouldn't you feel better if it was true? If it was real, you know? So yeah, because like again, you could be a poet and just say stuff because it sounds good and makes people feel good, you know? And you could say that, oh, well, the value of my words is based on how many people, is based on how I feel, independent of others, or it's based on how many people like it, how many views I got. But maybe the value for a lot of things is like how real it is, how accurate my words represent the truth or reality, whatever you want to say. So yeah, okay. So in this situation, there's our own mental apparatus. There's how this apparatus exists with others, and then how groups function, like whether a social group is healthy or not. So yeah, okay. Okay, where are you guys at now? Any thoughts or feedback before I continue? Okay, so we're at 9:35. Okay, so yeah, so part of the situation here is
Is reality subjective
Mhm.
based on where you're from? I'd say
well, what do you mean by subjective?
that's what I go with this. I'm like, I got the question, but it's a perception basically, influenced by personal feelings, tastes, or opinions.
Reality can influence a subjective experience, but reality, I would say, is that which it exists independent of human perception or human perspective. Same thing. Human experience.
But we
You
say
know?
it depends like geographically too. Like someone that's in a second or third world country might have a completely different perspective of reality compared to someone living in a first world country or someone that's been living here their whole life.
Well, maybe parts of reality.
Well, I mean the fundamentals, yeah, like the sun and the moon and gravity and like all the basic ones. But
Okay, so there's a difference between like reality and value. So people from different cultures, this is something that we talked about in this class that I didn't have time to complete, so I had to drop it, but it's the philosophy of social science. And anthropologists would argue something called ethical relativism, or relativism in general. And cognitive science responds directly to that our cognitive apparatus is developed in our early stages of development, developed in our early years as kids, that is based on our evolutionary trajectory and is independent of cultural influence. So somebody that is born in one area of the world will still perceive blue as blue,
Oh.
even though, you know, they have a different climate and a completely different sociocultural background. So if you showed like a blue sky and a blue crayon and a blue bird, and then you had an orange pumpkin, the sun, and a car, they would be able to cluster them in different categories. And then you could like have gradients. You could have like a teal color and like a aqua color or like a slightly greenish color. And then, you know,
Wouldn't everyone's perception be different? Like different color, like shades of blue based on.
there's gonna be some variance based on your eye and maybe your genetics to some degree, you know, like certain people from northern climates, like I was told by one of my teachers, I don't know about the evidence for this, but the claim was that they can see better in dark climates where there's like not as much sunlight. So they have like infrared vision a little bit better, or sorry, can see in the dark better. Yeah. I don't think we have to test that out again at the same time. These are claims to be falsified, you know? So value, however, is different. And that's a facet of socialization, which is to say like what's important. So like in some environments, maybe like here in Toronto, raccoons are to be like proceeded with caution. Like don't start, it's not a cat. You know, don't be like, hey, little buddy, blah, blah, blah. Like, be careful because they can have like diseases and shit. They're non-domesticated. They can hurt you, right? And so the value for that is to stay away. It's like, don't value them. You know, they eat garbage. They're unhealthy, right? Don't let your kids play with the raccoon in the backyard. Not a good idea, right? So, whereas in a different climate, you know, maybe like, so where I'm from, like wolves are kind of a thing, but there's a lot of bears actually, like a huge black bear, like just big thing, very like 600-pound just bear, and they're at the dump often, and there's signs, don't feed the bears, right? Because people do that. They'll, as entertainment. I don't know if anyone's seen that movie, The Great Outdoors, from like the 80s or the early 90s, John Candy. And they go to the dump, and I love that movie. It reminds me of Thunder Bay. Have you seen this? Oh, you'd love it because it's, you know. And they go to the dump, and they're throwing food at the bears, and the bears literally go on the car and are like pushing the car down, and they drive away with the bear on the car because they're trying to get away from it. So, yeah, the point is that we can socialize. This is why this is the thing. This is like about being philosophical, which I think, you know, and I'm going to say has something to do with the truth, that it's important for us to value reality. We want it to go this way. Reality isn't created by what we value. That's subjective. But it's important for us to value reality. For example, if you're on a high-rise building and the structure that's going up and down, the lift, there's something wrong with the lift, it's important to know that attending to that and making sure it's safe comes before like getting the work done, right? Like as a part-time carpenter right now, for example, I was using a drill today. I have this tool and I'm using my strength to hold the screw and push it. And sometimes the thing that the screw goes on is like worn out. And so the screw is going like this. And guess what fucking happens sometimes? I'm pushing it and then the screw goes off flying somewhere. And today I crushed my thumb and I yelled out because it hurt. And so the value, and most times when I'm using the drill, I put pressure, but I have some ability to like, if it goes, I can stop. But in that moment, I wasn't being mindful. My value, like the algorithm was get the screw in. And then that's where my brain was first. And then after that, it was like, there was nothing there. But usually it's like, be safe and then screw. And so because in that moment, my mind was on this one, guess what happened? And a wise carpenter always does that one. For example, if you're on a scaffold, okay, some guys will hold the ceiling and move the scaffold. And then guess what this like 65-year-old man did like last year? Fell off the scaffold, right? We could say that that was unwise. Efficiency trumps safety. It's not good. Reality is when you hit the ground. Like these concrete examples of like carpentry, they're really good because it's like you can visualize it. And when you're wrong about shit, like if you like I go back to those philosophy people that are studying, trying to be philosophical or being philosophers, if you're wrong, if your social hierarchy doesn't promote reality or truth, and you're just doing poetry, you're being a sophist because your psychological state, you had some trauma or some shit in your life, and you need to justify to yourself some way of being so you feel better about your life and have meaning, but it's incongruent. It doesn't actually make sense. When you get down to the fundamental principles that everything is based on and your motivations for doing it. Right? And sometimes the motivations might just be like, there was funding there. They paid me to do it. Is that the right reason? How many lives do you have? You know, could you have not found other ways to make money? What's money for? To eat, to have shelter. Okay. How much do you need? Right? Do you really need that much? And so our initial trajectory, where we're going, so in Stephen Covey's book, Habit 2 is begin with the end in mind. What that means is he has this story in the book. So, okay, so the story is, so go down here. There's this forest, okay? So this is like bird's eye view, and there's all these trees. And the village is right here, okay? And the people are over here. But they can't see the village. So if the people are here, right? And then this is like the tribe, the village is right here. All this stuff's in the way. They actually don't know which direction the village is. And so what you could do is you could just be like, I'm going to go by how I feel. I'm going to go this way. I feel like it's the right way. I'm going to do my heuristic number one system one processing. But you don't know for sure. It may or may not be in that direction. You could be right, but we don't know. And so to begin with the end in mind is to make sure your direction is correct first and then start going in that way. And so what he says, what you need to do is you need to climb up the tree and have a different perspective so you can see that the village is this way before you begin. And then you start clear cutting or going through the jungle or whatever you're faced with, right? And so that's a big part of that begin with the end in mind principle. It is an important axiom in all of our endeavors. Yes.
There is a quotation, I can't recall by whom, but it says something to the effect of, if you give me 3 hours to cut down a tree, I will spend 2 hours sharpening the axe.
Yeah.
So I feel like this is kind of good, like kind of connecting with what you're saying.
There's nothing wrong with an individual having their own perspective or doing their own independent trajectory. That's good. That's what makes us distinct. It does give us meaning. It's important. But fundamentally, it is also more important to make sure whatever you are doing is good, accurate, on point, congruent to reality, makes sense, right? And I find in my experience studying philosophy for academically for, I don't know, like over 10 years, a lot of people, they don't get good at taking criticism or looking at their underlying psychological motivations for what's going on. They're only focused on specific content, and then there's a lot of confirmation bias going on, right? They seek confirming evidence and get really, really good at that, and they don't look at all of the other perspectives and spend time really grounding themselves to have a very, I don't know, holistic is not, I don't want to use it because it's a very like psychobabble term. Gestalt is kind of a pseudoscience term in some ways. Yeah.
Unfortunately, it is my understanding that social media algorithms work in this way, that when you are interested in one sort of view of life or whatever it is, your feed becomes an echo chamber where it will show you more of the same thing. And what you believe may be very wrong and not right off the mark and be completely off the mark, but it will continue to give you that kind of confirmation bias that actually, no, you are right, because look how many people agree with you. And I think it's quite dangerous, especially with the younger generation, because they don't get that kind of grounding thing that you're talking about, the ability to kind of step back and think, does this actually make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, and so this is the precursor to learning philosophy. I think that it's important to situate ourselves in a social context first and then explore the history of philosophy, starting with like the ancient Greeks and or some Eastern philosophy like Confucianism, Taoism, etc. I think that it's important when it comes to the history of philosophy, like when we're talking about content itself and being philosophical, this dialogue or discussion that's been going on with these humans for a little while, there's some key thinkers that I would say it's important. So Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching, Confucius, Sun Tzu, The Art of War. At the least, I would say, for Eastern philosophy, when it comes to Western philosophy, there's some pre-Socratics, like Parmenides.
You say Marcus Aurelius?
We're getting to that. Heraclitus.
Heraclitus, you said?
Yeah.
Where was he from?
Greece. I think so, that area. And then the Greeks, which would be like Plato, Aristotle, Seneca, and then the Stoics, which is Aurelius would be there, Epictetus, Epicurus. I don't have room to continue with that. We can almost like in the religious discussion, we can go through like St. Augustine, Aquinas, Boethius, but it's not 100% relevant for what I'm doing. It's kind of a tangent. Like if Christianity just didn't exist, I don't think those guys would have really been anybody, obviously, because they're saints, right? So we can almost go straight from Stoicism, skip the Dark Ages, skip all the Christian stuff. We can have it would be just a separate course, you know, where you go through the arguments of God and then understand what's going on there.
By Dark Ages, you mean like the Crusades and stuff?
Yeah, like the pre-Enlightenment stage, pre-Renaissance.
It's like 1,000 years where nothing happened, basically.
Yeah, because everybody just only read the Bible and took it literally and burned a bunch of people alive. Not cool.
Not cool.
You know, I like sometimes I visualize like a superhero going back in time, just like fighting all these crazy people, fucking hurting people and shit.
Was that before the church split or after?
Before. Protestant Reformation was like later on.
Like 1600s.
I have to check the date on that, 100%. Okay, so then we go to the early modern period, which starts with Descartes, basically. And they discuss this issue of empiricism and rationalism. Philosophy, so this is important. It's an approach to knowledge. How do we know things? Do we know things through experience, or do we know things through reason? Yes.
I just searched it up. The Crusades happened after the schism. So after the church split, Catholics went.
What year was the Crusades?
The Crusades was 1096. It occurred between that 1096 and 1291.
Mhm.
And then the schism happened in 1054, 1050.
What's the type in Protestant Reformation?
What's the Protestant?
Maybe I don't know what you mean by the
Like the schism, like he's church with the West Church.
Okay.
Like Catholics with, or
Oh, I'm thinking something else.
oh, how'd you call it? Protestant
Protestant Reformation.
Reformation. Well, that's like 1517.
Yeah. Okay, so empiricism rationalism is a distinction between how we gain knowledge. One is through reason alone, the other is through experience. And philosophy fundamentally has been rationalist. That reason is the methodology to be philosophical. And as contradictory as it might seem, I am a very empiricist as a philosopher, and that is which distinguishes me from almost the entire academic discipline. And that's why we have this group, because I believe that there's a practice of being and living that is wise and is more fundamental than our reason, because because of all of this social bias stuff, we can think something's true, and that's where we get into our principles of scientific thinking, that it's important for us to falsify statements, for example, right? To test stuff out. Why? Because sometimes you're wrong. Reason may be true, like you might be correct, but to know, it still has to be empirical. Fundamentally, even the process of reasoning, the act of processing, is an experience. So being reasonable is always situated within experience. It's the experience of being reasonable. Always. You're not a disembodied entity, and that's the problem with philosophers, I find, is that they kind of romanticize what it means to be philosophical, and you get this armchair discipline. Like, I see philosophers as like superheroes. You need to get out in the fucking world and do something. Okay, you can read books and write papers, sure, but some of your time needs to be devoted to making a healthy social group, or else you're not wise. Are you the wise man or person? Are you? What are you doing? I'm drinking wine or cognac and I'm thinking about Husserl's approach towards phenomenology. Okay, that's great. You can do that, but it's important to go out into the world and figure out how to, like, I don't know, deal with the Kremlin and help the Ukrainian people and the Russian people not have to have this problem anymore. That's a great thing for the world. That's a wise thing to do. Or prevent Taiwan from being invaded by China. That's good. And it's not just a political thing. You know, don't look at it from the frame that, oh, that's for political scientists to deal with. Well, if you're the philosopher, aren't you like the on at the top? It's not my field. Okay. But maybe you have something to bring from your perspective that would help us solve the problem that no one else thought about.
How would they respect the philosopher? Sorry.
The same way we do this stuff. So any person that makes a criticism or claim, we evaluate it based on its merit and its content. We could, that's a whole thing in itself. Like, yeah, you have to demonstrate via your input why to be respected and through your actions. But just, you know, being a graduate student that just drinks alcohol and laughs with their friends doesn't necessarily make you wise. And so what claim do you have saying that you're philosophical? Saying that you're reasonable some of the time. You've done some reading.
Kind of what you were saying about philosophers having to go out into the real world and being an empiricist. This is going to sound simplistic, but again, it goes down to the very basic idea that life has to be lived to be understood.
Sure. Yeah.
You learn about life by being in life. I know that sounds kind of redundant, but there's so much truth to that, I think. If you can sit in your room and philosophize as much as you want and try to plan out everything, but you need to get out into the real world to kind of get a real grip of what the reality is like. And if your ideas can hold water out there.
Yeah, like reason, like there may be some things that are a priori that we can know without experience, you know, but reasoning is a psychological process and is limited to our psychological capacity. You know, it's limited to the information at our disposal. There may be some pure, like when I say pure, there may be some like inferences that can be drawn that are based in the symbology that we're using or fundamental properties of our experience, like space and time.
Could it be dangerous, perhaps, to over-rationalize things in your mind rather than just living in the present in your body? Because, I mean, for example, is it possible that your body can calculate certain things quicker than your mind can? Kind of primordial instincts that, you know, your body already knows before your mind is able to make that connection. I don't know. For me, it's kind of always a struggle between not using the mind too much and also not just relying on this kind of bodily intuition too much at the same time. That sweet spot between the two. But I believe that there are something that we can know before the brain even knows it. That's just my own theory.
Yeah. That's like system 1, system 2 thinking.
Okay.
Sometimes like there's the instincts and then there's like your slow, deliberate reasoning process.
Okay.
But sometimes our instincts can be incorrect. So there's a judgment thing. That's where it's like there's a practice. And that's why being willing to make certain mistakes, like I have a feeling that this is the right path for me, but it may be wrong. So I'm going to check it out and like, whoa, that's what that is. Like, whoa. And now my feelings next time are going to be a little different, right? Whereas if I'm averse towards exploring and interacting with situations, right? Like that thing I talked to you guys about before. The next time I approach similar circumstances, my feelings will change. So yes, social context, fifth period philosophy, empiricism, rationalism. We didn't get to the function stuff yet, but that's on the mind.
Yeah.